Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, we will look briefly at three dimensions. Number one, is challenging autopsy findings okay? Number two, the legal narrative. And number three, the True Crime Rocket Science analysis versus the Lifetime mainstream view. The third version is the one that we'll really concentrate this episode on. In terms of challenging an autopsy finding, now it seems to be the nature of society that when we see something written down, we think that that is absolute inviolable fact, whether it's written in the media, whether it's the statement of a criminal, something that is written down we believe is basically gospel. There's something about the written word that seems to just say, okay, this is the way it is. So something like an autopsy statement, it's often authored by a doctor, and we, as a result, we sort of feel like, wow, who are we to argue with that, right? So just to be very sort of kind of simplistic about it, is challenging an autopsy finding okay? Of course it is. It happens all the time. It's the stuff. It's the kernel of what court cases are all about. Can you interpret this bruise or that mark or that color or that particular line or whatever it is this way or that way? Does it mean this or does it mean that, right? A fairly contemporary example of an autopsy finding that is widely and kind of officially accepted, but nevertheless controversial, and many people don't accept it, is the autopsy finding of Rebecca Zahau. There's an autopsy finding, an official finding that's also supported by law enforcement, and a lot of people just simply disagree with it. They say the official autopsy finding is that Rebecca Zahau died of ligature asphyxiation, and that her manner of death is suicide, that she died by hanging, not by strangling. And there's a classic example where you have kind of a battle between expert coroners, where one guy will say it's definitely ligature strangulation, another one will say it's definitely manual strangulation, right? I'm not going to talk about that here just because we're not here to talk about the Zahau case, but I'm certainly on the side of manual strangulation, that it wasn't a hanging, and also there's another case that sort of was playing out at about the same time as the Zahau case in South Africa, the Jason Roeder case. In that case, it was also, is this ligature strangulation or manual strangulation? And you had exactly the same arguments over exactly the same kind of testimony. And you literally had, in the Roeder case, which is quite both horrifying and I guess interesting, is you had 2-3 sets of we call them pathologists here, but it's the coroners, experts going on, some for the defense, some for the prosecution. So you'd have 1, 2, 3 experts all saying the same thing for the one side, and then 1, 2, I think it was only 2 in the state's case saying something else. And then you almost have a circus where it's like, oh, well, if you have 10 experts saying the same thing compared to 3 or 4 on the other, is it the number of experts, is that now going to make one version better than the other? The point is, in autopsies, you can argue, you can see nuances in the evidence, and it happens all the time. So something that's just very, I think, simple to express about autopsies is, an autopsy is like the physical body, the physical human body version of coming to a crime scene after the fact and interpreting the data. So in the same way you can have a cover-up with digital data that's removed or staged or whatever, you can also have staged injuries. You can have things that misrepresent. You can have bodies put in a freezer. There are all sorts of things that can mask other things. You can have old injuries that didn't occur at the time, or did occur at the time. You can have things that, is this a post-mortem injury or did it happen at the time? So you absolutely can challenge an autopsy finding. And to relate all of that to this case, I've challenged, I guess, the autopsy finding in the Watts case to say that I believe the children weren't necessarily smothered. I'm saying it's possible that they were, but I don't think it's necessarily true. And I believe that they were sedated and they died of an overdose. And there's quite a few reasons to say that. One of them, the fact that they turned blue, or the fact that Chris Watts said they turned blue, and in his first version. You can argue against that and say, well, that's just what he said, or something like that. But there are some classic symptoms of asphyxia where the victim struggles against being killed. And now you can argue that for whatever reason Shan'ann didn't struggle as depicted in the Lifetime movie, but are you telling me both children didn't struggle either? And you get typical artifacts from struggling, and I want to show them to you in this episode, what it looks like, what the lungs look like when someone is strangled, how the lungs kind of respond, if that's the word. And in terms of the toxicology, and I will sort of deal with that kind of in the next section, the legal narrative, but people would say, I've had a lot of people say, are you crazy? Have you not read the autopsy reports? Are you not aware that oxycodone never came up in the autopsy? And my response is, yes, it's true. So you've made a good point there. You've made a legally defensible point. And then my response is, are you aware that the children weren't just, this wasn't a conventional disposal of bodies. There were chemicals involved, right? That is idiosyncratic to this case. That is very unique to this case, is that they were kind of suspended in hot chemicals for a number of days, not half an hour or an hour, not just 24 hours, but many hours over several days. And it seems to be, most people seem to be saying, yeah, so what? So what that they were in this, what would that have to do with the toxicology? So them being in chemicals for several days wouldn't affect the chemical results of tests. So anyway, that is the True Crime Rocket Science version, and you can certainly argue that the absence of evidence tends to prove that they weren't sedated. But I would argue that the chemicals destroyed a lot of evidence. That's what I would argue, and it's also the reason they were put in the chemicals, to destroy that evidence. And in that sense, Chris Watts has outwitted seemingly most people. Chris Watts, this dumb criminal, has outfoxed most people, if that aspect is true. So in terms of the legal narrative, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, there definitely was a peculiar unfolding of events around the autopsy. I don't know how good your memories are in terms of this. I don't know if you remember, everyone was waiting for the autopsy results to come out. There was like no information. In September, there was sort of like this strange silence that descended over the Watts case, which actually persisted in a way through October as well. There was a lot of coverage on HLN, then that stopped, and then suddenly everything stopped. And one of the things we thought would break that kind of impasse was the autopsy results would come out, and then we would have clarity. And then seemingly out of nowhere, the autopsy reports simply didn't come to light when everyone expected them to. That was kind of in mid-September. That's what the previous episode in What Else Do We Know was all about, or touched on. I don't want to go into too much detail, just because it is quite confusing. You kind of have a situation of the public expected the autopsy reports, there was a deadline when the reports didn't come out, then there was a counter sort of motion from the prosecution saying, well, they're not ready. They don't even have them. So the reason this was in September, the reason the prosecution said we can't give you the autopsies because we don't have them ourselves. Now, I remember thinking about that same thing when Nora Corrin, the Irish-French girl, disappeared in a Malaysian jungle. Basically, what happened when they found her body was her body went straight to the pathologists, as in they discovered her body, it was taken straight to a hospital, and they immediately kind of commenced with an autopsy. And it was literally a matter of hours. It was something like, it was delayed, but it was literally, we're going to find out in 12 hours or 24 hours or 36 hours. I think it was within, I'll say this under correction, but I think it was definitely within 3 days. It may have been close to the 48-hour mark where everyone sort of found out, okay, so she died of starvation, stress. She did have some kind of intestinal bleeding from an ulcer, but they basically said that the cause of death was that she died of starvation. Now, the reason I'm mentioning it is, in this case, they were able to do an autopsy and provide the results with everyone wanting to know within like 2 days. 2 days. 2 or 3 days, certainly not more than 3 days. In the Watts case, obviously it wasn't one victim, there were 3 victims, but you kind of had a situation where a month later, the reports still weren't available, and in other words, the reports still hadn't been handed over to the public. And what's more, the DA said, well, we can't give them to you because we don't have them ourselves. And you can go and look in the discovery yourselves and go and look at the dates on those autopsy reports, and I'll show them to you. It's quite tricky the way things sort of went out. You sort of had an article in People magazine saying, oh, the autopsy results aren't available, that's why we can't give them to you. And then it was like the day after that article that the toxicology was finally signed, or something like that. And then it was available, but they just said it's not available, and then everything just sort of, nothing happened after that. So there was definitely a weird thing going on. If you're going to ask why, there are a couple of possibilities. One possibility is that Chris Watts himself asked that it not be released, that Chris Watts knew what the results would be, and that he didn't, in order to give the district attorney what they wanted, which was not have the case go to trial, or in order for the plea deal to be agreed, there were probably some underlying agreements, and maybe one of them was not to release the autopsy reports. It could also be completely different. Could also have been certain interests didn't want any further attention or interest in the Watts case. They wanted to shut it down. They wanted the case to go away. They didn't want the case to go to trial. They wanted the media interest to die down, and one of the best ways was by not releasing the autopsy results, because that would get people chattering and speculating. So that's another possibility. There's also a third possibility, which is that the prosecution were afraid to release the results because it didn't implicate, I don't want to put it that way. Let me put it another way. They didn't want to release the autopsy results because this might feed into the defense case. This might feed into Chris Watts thinking, hang on, I might actually have a defense here. They don't actually have that much evidence on me. So that's another possibility. And I think that's quite a strong possibility. The impression I have is that Chris Watts was under the impression that they knew that oxycodone was found in Shannann's autopsy. That's something he said in a letter to Sherilyn Cadle, that was found in the medical examiner's report, because he put it there. Now, that creates like a can of worms. Either, so where is that medical examiner's report? Or is Chris Watts lying about it? And then you say, well, why would he lie about something that's worse? It's that same argument. Why would he lie about something that's worse? And this does sort of raise the question, is there a supplemental autopsy report that we're not aware of, that's been held back? We also know that there was Shannan's blood alcohol level, and that also could have given Chris Watts a potential way to provide, come up with a defense. So that's another possibility. But there you kind of had, in Shannan's toxicology, you had a value that someone might want to use to their own advantage. I talk in some detail about the legal narrative around the autopsies and the third confession in my book Silver Fox, The Third Confession. I'd like to be a lot more thorough on this and a lot more on point with the facts and the documents and everything, but this is just not the forum for it. I just also don't have, there's no time to go through it meticulously. It would really take quite a long time. And that's not what this particular episode's about. This episode is dealing with the True Crime Rocket Science analysis of Shannan's autopsy versus the Lifetime and the mainstream depiction and view of it. So let's deal with that now. So if we go to page 827 of the discovery, I'm just gradually taking you through it. You basically just have the photo log of the autopsy, and that's something just to bear in mind. We haven't seen any photos of the autopsy, so if you think, oh no, I think you're being totally unreasonable, we know everything there is to know about this case. Well, we haven't seen a single photo from the autopsies, and that's also fairly uncommon. I've certainly, in my investigations with various cases, I've gotten access to, and it's pretty gruesome things to go through, but I've been able to look at the autopsy photos of Rebecca Zahau, of Susan Roeder, of Reva Steenkamp, of, these are all people, and, on the autopsy table, they're reduced to, some horrifying sort of pictures, but also very, very high profile cases like John Benet Ramsey. So it's fairly common that autopsy results are released. Another example is West Memphis 3. Another example is Meredith Kircher. So I'm not saying that, please release the Watts autopsy photos. I'm simply saying that they haven't been released, and that's an aspect that has been withheld. And you see it on page 827. They show the numbers of the photos, and there are a lot of photos of Shan'ann Watts. It's from photo number 0610 to 0694. So basically 84 images of Shan'ann Watts. In terms of Bella, there are around about 42, just over 40 images of Bella. And bear in mind, Bella had specific injuries that were unique to her. And then Cece has around about the same amount, 40 or so images, Cece. And these images were included in a report dated September 21st. So there's no way these photos could have been taken and the report written if the autopsy hadn't been done or hadn't been complete, right? So just bear that in mind. This is dated September the 21st. And the public only got to see the autopsy results when the plea deal was done and dusted. So kind of when it was too late. So, in other words, too late to not appeal or too late to demand a trial or any of those things. So November 19th, basically 2 months later, the autopsy results, such as they were, came to light. If we go to Shan'ann Watts' autopsy, I'm only going to highlight one aspect here. There's a lot to talk about, but I'm going to try and keep it simple because it can get quite complicated. So I'm just going to touch on this word atelectatic, and another version of the word is atelectasis, which is a complete or partial collapse of the entire lung or certain lobes of the lung, and it occurs when the air sacs become totally deflated. And atelectasis is a common complication after surgery, and I'm going to deal with why that is and how that is and how it relates to this case. At this point, the most important thing to bear in mind is that it's in the autopsy and it's referred to in terms of Shan'ann Watts, right? It talks about her lungs being markedly, that is significantly, atelectatic, okay? So I want to emphasize that, and at the same time emphasize what is also brought up in this first paragraph, that there are no masses or gross areas of consolidation. In other words, there's no kind of obvious rupturing of the small little capillaries and vesicles and cells inside the lungs, and that's not mentioned there for fun. The fact that that is highlighted is saying they would expect that, but it's not there. That's why they talk about it. But the part that I want you to focus on is those words markedly atelectatic, okay? When we go to the children's autopsy, you get the same thing in terms of the consolidation. It talks about there are no masses or gross areas of consolidation, right? The trachea and bronchi are unremarkable. The difference here between the children's lungs and Shanann's hers are a kind of a brownish color, whereas the children's are not. They're kind of a pink tan to purple color, whereas Shanann's are tan brown. You'd almost think it would be the other way around, that the children's lungs would have almost like a different color. And some people have spoken about that they drowned and that they, but there was no oil in their lungs. The oil was in there. There was a little bit of oil in one of their stomachs. There wasn't oil in the lungs. There was some, I guess, penetration of the oil into their bodies, but not into their lungs, not enough to discolor the lungs. So let's familiarize ourselves with what we're talking about here. I did mention it earlier, but let's just go through it again. Atelectasis is the collapse or closure of a lung resulting in reduced or absent gas exchange. So, the lungs are like balloons, and, as they open up, we breathe, and as they close, and they don't, when we expire, our lungs don't collapse. It's not like it's a balloon with nothing in them. They're simply less open than what they were. Okay. So it refers here to usually unilateral, so that atelectasis usually happens to one lung, not both. It's a condition where the alveoli are deflated down to virtually no volume, right? And it's not the same as them being filled with liquid. It's just simply that they deflated completely. And this was a marked feature with Shan'ann. Now I'm going to take you to the text of the John Benet Ramsey autopsy report. And here again, you can argue with me. You can say, okay, I think you're wrong. I don't think this applies. I don't think John Benet died of asphyxiation. I think she died of head trauma. And I would then give you the thumbs up and say, well, if that's your argument, then listen no further. If that's your argument, okay, well then that's your opinion. I would say the head. I don't really even want to go into that. Anyway, let's assume that this autopsy result is accurate and is referring to the results of asphyxia. Can we at least agree on that? Can we agree that asphyxia may have been a factor with John Benet Ramsey, given that she was garroted? Can we agree on that? So if we do agree on that, then if we go to the text, and the reason I'm referring to what is quoted in a Denver Post article is it's public knowledge. You can go and read this up yourself. You don't have to kind of, apply to some authority to get it. It's public knowledge. And this is a quotation from the autopsy, so it's not a reporter saying this, it's quoted from the autopsy, and it refers to the lungs, and it refers to an occasional scattered subpleural petechial hemorrhage in each lung, right? That's something I've kind of banged the drum on for ages, is that there are no petechial hemorrhages anywhere in the Watts case. There are no petechial hemorrhages with Shan'ann and none with the children, but especially the children. And so if you're going to say that the children were smothered, where are their petechial hemorrhages? In the lungs, that's what we're talking about. In the lungs, where are the petechial hemorrhages? This episode isn't really about that. I want to focus more on Shan'ann, right? And so we are focusing on Shan'ann. And so the question is, why doesn't she have petechial hemorrhages in her lungs? And the autopsy doesn't refer to that. It's one of the key things that they look for, and it's not there. And I can tell you now, petechial hemorrhages are a classic symptom of asphyxia. What happens is your body is burning, it is striving, it is struggling to breathe. And as you are trying to breathe, but you're in a situation where something is forcing you not to breathe, you kind of have these ruptures, these tiny little ruptures all through the body. It's not only in the lungs, it's in the eyes, in the little capillaries in the eyes. It's also in the little capillaries in the cheeks and in the face. All of these things start kind of bursting with this desperate need to breathe, to stay alive. And yet you don't see any of this in the autopsy report. In fact, what the autopsy report in terms of the Watts shows is the absence of this. It doesn't simply just not refer to it. It says no petechial hemorrhage. No petechial hemorrhage. Not, oh, there was petechial hemorrhage. And so that is the weird part with the autopsy findings, is you've now got the absence of evidence in the autopsy, and that then raises the very serious and significant question, how did these people die? Chris Watts says they were strangled, so why is there no evidence that any of them were strangled? There's a little bit of evidence that Shan'ann may have been strangled or attacked around her throat, but it's also not a classic strangling. It's not a typical strangling that we would associate with Rebecca Zahau or Susan Roeder or many other strangling victims. So what is going on here? It's also not typical because there are no defensive wounds. You look at someone who died of asphyxiation, and because she bled to death, like Meredith Kercher. Meredith Kercher is another example where you could say she didn't die of asphyxia, she died of bleeding to death. You could argue it sort of like that. But another argument is that the blood that came out of her throat flowed down her windpipe, and so she died because she couldn't breathe. And I apologize for the graphicness of what we're talking about, but there are some classic symptoms of asphyxia. And so now I want to take you through Michael Burson's autopsy report. It refers to the date and time of the autopsy report as August 17th at 10:30. So this is when the autopsy it's when the autopsy commenced August 17th. Bear in mind, the media and people were waiting for this report a month later, basically, around about the same time in September. If we go to the toxicology report, it's dated the 12th of September. Report issued 12th of September at 2 o'clock. And this is the autopsy for Bella Watts. This was 9 days before, arguably 5 days before people were required to, the state was required to turn it over, kind of on the deadline. It was, I think the People magazine article came out, I'm not sure if it was the 21st or the 26th. I think it was the 26th. But essentially, this toxicology report of Bella Watts was already available on the 12th. At least a week before then. If we look at the autopsy report for Bella Watts, it's dated, this is when the autopsy was conducted, August 16th at 1750. And then this is kind of the bottom line. If we look at the date that this was signed off, so this was the last moment that anyone was still trying to figure out the autopsy, right? This was September the 27th, 2018. So this is sort of the last moment that they were sort of looking at what was going on. And it's something that I've stressed in the narratives I've written is the opinion that is provided here it is, and this quoting from the autopsy, from the toxicology, based on the history provided and the autopsy findings, the cause of death is asphyxiation. Not based on the evidence, it's saying based on the history provided, and who provided the history? Chris Watts. The history was provided by Chris Watts saying, I strangled them, I smothered them. So in other words, this report is based on his version of events because there was so little information in the autopsies. Does that make sense? So in other words, your autopsy is basing itself on a liar's version of events. And the reason I never believed it to begin with was I thought, why on earth, if in Chris Watts' version, first version, where the children were smothered and Shan'ann had just finished smothering Cece, why wouldn't you just push Shan'ann aside and perform CPR and try and bring her back alive? Because you can. That happens all the time. And instead, Chris Watts said, no, well, she was blue. She was clearly, it's almost like he was saying she'd been dead for a while. But he was actually just saying she was clearly dead. But you wouldn't just turn blue. People who are asphyxiated don't immediately turn blue. They turn red. They've just been struggling. There's a rush of blood to fight off the attack. And if you look at John Benet Ramsey's post-mortem picture, she doesn't really look blue. She kind of looks quite normal. There's quite a lot of blood on the one side of her face, on the side of the floor. What's interesting is if you go to the end of the autopsy report, discovery page 1040. Now, if you go just a little bit further, you'll see just the normal, the sketches and the signatures. And then when it comes to CC, it cuts off at 1040, and then there's nothing. There's no signing off. There's no, it looks like 7 pages are missing from this section of the discovery, because it goes 1040 at this part of the autopsy, and then it jumps to 1047. So where are those 7 pages? So if we go to the lifetime depiction, and it seems to be the depiction most people, I think most people listening to this video would put up their hands and say, yes, I agree. I think that's what happened. I think Chris Watts and Shan'ann had an argument. Now, I played a clip yesterday where Coda, this was Coda on Tuesday night, very, very early, kind of like as early as you could get in the Watts case. talking to Chris Watts, and Coda now gives Watts his version of what he thinks happened. And what does he say? He says, I think there was an argument, maybe you talked to her, maybe you didn't, right? And what Coda is acknowledging there is, I'm not sure if I believe you. In fact, he'd said earlier that I don't believe what you've said. I simply do not believe you. And one of the things Chris Watts said was that he'd argued with his wife that morning, like at a very weird hour, like at 4 o'clock. And a lot of people seem to agree with that. They say, yes, no. They also think that he argued. Him and Shan'ann were face to face, and Shan'ann had no defensive wounds. And Chris Watts would have sort of confronted Shan'ann, because that's the kind of guy he was, a very confrontational guy. He would have confronted her. He would have said, I want a divorce. And Shan'ann, as in the Lifetime movie, would have said, are you cheating on me? Are you having an affair? And Shan'ann would have shouted and screamed and been very upset. And Chris Watts would have been totally happy with that. In a premeditated mode, he'd be, well, if she gets upset, it's fine. I'll handle it. Really? Anyone who says that knows zippo about true crime, knows zippo about the criminal mind, knows zippo about criminal psychology. In a premeditated crime, why are you going to agitate, alarm, activate, prepare your victim ahead of attacking them? And these are two fairly evenly matched people. They're both in their early 30s. And so you have a situation depicted in Lifetime where Chris Watts is facing Shan'ann. First of all, he's sitting on her in the bed. Then she doesn't scratch him. Then he doesn't bruise her. Then they have a second encounter. Then she doesn't scratch him. Then he doesn't bruise her again. And Shan'ann just lies there and then dies. And there's no petechial hemorrhages. Is that why? Because she just lay there and was like, well, my lungs are looking, and I don't mean to be offhand, I'm just ridiculing this version. Although my lungs are screaming for air, I'm just going to wait. Nobody in the history of the world would ever do that. If you think that's an unreasonable statement to say, I challenge you to sit wherever you are right now and purposefully hold your breath for 1 minute. 1 minute. And so we now link the autopsy to the True Crime Rocket Science version, and it's done. I'm going to do it quite simply. So just a reminder, there were no masses, there was no petechial hemorrhages, no consolidation. But what you did have in Shanann's lungs was atelectasis, right? It was atelectactic or tatic. The lungs had collapsed. And if we go to, and you can Google this, it's under the Mayo Clinic version of it. And what it refers to here is that it's commonly caused as a result of general anesthesia. Let me say that again. This condition of collapsed lungs typically happens following general anesthesia. And what they kind of refer to it happening is it's one of the complications of surgery. Someone's received an anesthetic, they go through surgery, and then you can have one lung literally collapsing as a result of this. The body's sort of involuntary processes shut down, and it's typically one lung where this happens. With Shan'ann, I think it was both. And so based on this, True Crime Rocket Science says it looks like Shan'ann was also anesthetized in some way. Then you say, well, in what way? I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I'm saying the autopsy findings suggest that this happened, that there was like a kind of an anesthesia while she was being attacked, right? And I think it's ludicrous. I think it's crazy to say, well, Chris Watts gave Shan'ann like a shake laced with oxycodone. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about something like a rag being placed over her mouth while she was being attacked. So in other words, the scenario I've always visualized was an attack from behind on the stairway, Shan'ann falling to the ground on the staircase, Watts then putting his knee on her back or his weight on her back, and because Shan'ann at that time had her hands full with her handbag, she couldn't kind of fight back, moving to someone behind her and on top of her. Plus she's pregnant, and now there's this weight pushing her body against the staircase, and you've got the edges of the stairs, which are carpeted, pushing against her lung, and Chris Watts from behind pushing against her lung while closing her throat. Plus there's kind of a rag or something, which could have had something like ethanol in it. It's not necessarily going to kill her, but it's going to cause her to not be able to fight back as she would otherwise have, and to lose consciousness sooner than she otherwise would have. That's the True Crime Rocket Science version. That's the version trying to explain, first of all, this symptom and also the lack of defensive wounds. And you could definitely argue, well, I'm sure that the edges of the steps would have caused bruises to Shan'ann somewhere. And that's a fairly valid argument. I would counter argue and say that it was carpeted, quite a thick carpet. Also that Chris Watts may have been pulling Shan'ann away from the stairs. In other words, in his effort to strangle her and cut off the blood flow, he may have pulled her head away from the ground. And Shan'ann, in order to escape his grip, had to pull herself towards the ground, which would only tighten this grip around her, if that makes sense. And even if Shan'ann did push towards the ground, she's now getting the rag further into her mouth. So she really had no escape in terms of this. And all this is an explanation. It's just a explanation where you're tying the certain things together. And if you have a better explanation that nevertheless is anchored in the evidence, I'm all ears. So if you can say, I argue this based on that and that and that, I'm all ears. Another reason that I think's not defensible, I don't think it would work in court, but it's an intuitive feeling, and the science seems to oppose it. So here I'm being a little bit mischievous and saying, well, I realize the science says it. I am wondering whether there could be another explanation. And what I'm getting at is the fact that Shanann's post-mortem alcohol levels flagged may have been because she was strangled with something like alcohol or ethanol. In other words, these amounts were, how can I put it, fed into the system just prior to her death. And I completely acknowledge the counter-argument, which is that her blood alcohol levels were completely consistent with normal decomposition. They were nevertheless elevated, is my counter-argument. But I acknowledge that it may not, what I'm saying may not be relevant. It may not be a strong form of argument. It's just something that I'm highlighting. I'm kind of trying to connect those two dots, but I acknowledge that maybe you can't. I just want to come back to John Bonet's autopsy report. I just want to highlight that again, this thing about subpleural petechial hemorrhages inside the lung. She had it on both lungs. She also had petechial hemorrhages in her face. If we go to another aspect of the autopsy report dealing with John Bonet, deals with the alveolar architecture of the lungs is well preserved. Pulmonary vascular congestion is identified. So there's congestion in the lungs. So just a final thing, just to sort of highlight, is Shanann's lungs being deflated, you could also argue happened post-mortem, that because she was buried face down, that this was an aspect. And I would then also try to join the dots by saying, well, wasn't she also killed in that position? Wasn't she also killed in a position of facing the ground, facing the stairs? But like forcibly, with a lot of pressure on her. So that is a strong counter argument you could make, is that this was a natural process of, what happened to her post-mortem that's got nothing to do with anything that I've said. Again, my counter argument would be, but there are no petechial hemorrhages. And so that shows she couldn't have been strangled in a typical way. And the same applies to the children. The children, I don't believe, were strangled. I don't believe they were smothered either. I just don't believe it. I also think there's a link between the non-confrontational way of how the children, I believe, were killed to how Shan'ann was killed. I don't believe you would have a confrontation and then, that kind of thing. I don't think you would, anyway. So that's basically just the position. And I know the mainstream don't agree with it. The mainstream seem to think that it's obvious. Shan'ann was strangled. The children were strangled. Who cares about the autopsy? It just doesn't correspond to the autopsies of many, many, many other cases. And that's a problem. And we would know this if the case went to trial, but since it hasn't gone to trial, who's going to highlight this sort of stuff? So I wanted to make this video because someone kind of left a comment. People have been accusing me of kind of being a conspiracy person myself, that I'm manufacturing information, that it's not based on anything. If you look at all of my books, all of my blogs, all of my YouTube videos, it's not me looking at the camera just blah, blah, blah all the time. It's me referring to information constantly sourcing information, giving you pages, giving you descriptions. It's all scientific. So scientific as I can possibly be. And yet people say it's not based on actual evidence. Of course it is. And so I want to do exactly that also with this shadow theory, which crazily enough is still persisting with people. So what I'm going to do is just a little bit of insight into my life and my background. My great-grandfather is a famous artist, and he actually studied the techniques of painting, Rembrandt, the Dutch artist, Rembrandt, and how Rembrandt's attitude to light, right? And so my great-grandfather learned from this Dutch master. He came to South Africa, and then he came to South Africa when it was kind of quite a young colony, and he painted beautiful landscapes of South Africa. You can Google his name. It's Tinus de Jong, Dejongh. And you can see these beautiful landscapes that he painted. He's one of the most well-known South African master landscape artists. But the interesting thing was, when he came to South Africa, he couldn't get the light right. He was painting with basically Dutch light in his mind. He was used to these sort of watered down kind of landscapes that were kind of watery and dark and sort of cloudy and overcast. And so when he came to South Africa, he wasn't used to blue skies. He wasn't used to this bright sunlight, and he really wasn't used to, when the sun sets, the light turns gold. Not like a light soft gold, but like a vivid scintillating gold. And when it touches the mountains, especially the Cape Mountains around Cape Town and that sort of area, those rocks which are already orange, at sunset turn like a golden color. And it's kind of like a fairy tale thing. When you've got a little farmstead there and the vineyards, it's beautiful, and you have this vivid scenario of this golden world just before the sun sets, and you have something similar when the sun rises as well, but it's even more so when the sun sets. And so it took him really a lifetime just to figure out the light, just to figure out, wow, this light really is gold. It's not this washed out thing in the Netherlands, you know. And so it took him a long time to get the light that he'd sort of educated himself in as a young man, kind of out of his mind, and say, where I am, this reality here is different. The light here is different. And I wanna take that same kind of psychology to you guys and say, because somebody said to me, you know, if you wait till you go to Colorado to photograph the driveway, I think by the time you get there, the house will be sold, or the house will be demolished or something. And so I thought, I can actually do that right now. Like, I can go to the Watts driveway right now, and I can do this experiment, because it seems like if I say it, people don't understand. It seems like, just like these conspiracy people need to show you how the shadows running around. Oh, I've seen it now. I don't need any more proof. I don't need anyone to say anything about it. I've seen it. And seeing is believing. So I need to do the same thing, and I can do the same thing. I can take you to the driveway, and I can show you how a shadow moves from left to right without anything moving from left to right. Let me say that again. I can take you to the driveway. I can show you a shadow moving from left to right without anything moving from left to right. And maybe you think I can't do that, and maybe you think I'm going to trick you or something. I'm not. It's going to be a very, very simple thing. But I will do that just because I feel like I need to do this just to get people off my back who people seem to think I make things up because I'm the conspiracy theorist, or I want to sell books or something. They don't realize this channel is called True Crime Rocket Science because it's about science, because it's about what to me is the most logical explanation. If you come and you say, I think this is a more logical, scientific, factual information based on the evidence, and you make a good argument. Anyone who comes with a better argument, I feel, than I have, I'm going to say, I'm throwing in the towel, this is definitely a better argument. So in any event, in terms of the shadows, I'm going to make this argument that I think is the better argument, and then let's see what you guys think. So if you guys are interested in that little experiment, that'll be the next episode on this channel. I can't be sure when it'll be. It might be tomorrow, but it might also be Monday. Just got a couple of things I want to do. I want to go and watch Birds of Prey. I've got cycling to do, cycling training, but it might be raining as well. So if that's the case, then it might come out sooner. But if you're interested in that and similar discussions, if you're interested in a scientific approach to true crime, you're going to find this channel interesting and compelling. For some reason, it seems like the truth is very slippery and very rare, and very few people seem to recognize it. It's a very rare commodity. And somebody said, you know, in a world full of lies and liars, telling the truth is a revolutionary act, and it often feels like that for me. I often feel like I'm fighting against the whole world. And people who think that I'm I don't know, manufacturing things to sell books, the easier way would just be to sell the lie, just to talk about the popular thing, to talk about Chris Watts is a narcissist, the children were alive at the well site, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, and there's so many versions of that. There's also Stephen Avery. No, I don't think he just committed this crime. I think he was framed. you could sell far more books making up that bogus version. So why not do it? Well, because I certainly care about the truth. I care about what I think is the truth. And I care that it is the truth. I care that what I think is the truth. Don't you? So thank you for listening. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Like, share, leave a comment, and I'll see you guys next time.